Drishyam 3 is a film that takes risks, maybe a bit too many of them for better and for worse. It goes places and does things very much unlike the previous films, complete with a very dark and disturbing climax and a rather unexpected ending that will forever alter the trajectory of the franchise. But don't get me wrong, it is very much alike the original and the sequel in some respects. It once again deals with the ethics and morality of Georgekutty, our lead, protecting his family when they are on the wrong side of the law, following the decade-old murder of his daughter's abuser and the scheming, deception and manipulation that he must perform in order to accomplish this. But the rather unique thing this film has going for it is the fact that it is very much unlike the original and the sequel, which were basically about Georgekutty being the smartest person in the room. Meanwhile, this film is all about Georgekutty on the defense at his most vulnerable, as the antagonists hatch an elaborate multi-layered scheme to trap him at his weakest. And as a result, this is not the usual hero-centric Georgekutty comes out on top thanks to its wits fun ride of a film that most of us were expecting based on the last two films. No, this film is less of an intelligent thriller and more of the equivalent of an ongoing panic attack that us and Georgekutty are subjected to, that for what is essentially a fun family film trilogy gets truly dark and disturbing by the end. But is that enough to stand toe to toe with Drishyams 1 and 2, considered by many to be one of the best Malayalam, nay, Indian thrillers ever made? Let's find out. But before that, this is the Indian Movie Critic. I put out videos on Indian cinema I find interesting. Subscribe to see more. Let's begin, and as always, no spoilers. Plot synopsis: 5 years after the events of Drishyam 2 and 13 years after that of the original, Georgekutty and his family are still being haunted by the demons of their past, but have managed to flourish and find some semblance of peace. But things are set in motion when a pair of journalists take an interest in his case and join forces with the antagonists of the previous films to bring him to justice. And that's where I will stop, because spoilers. Now, first and foremost, what I will 100% commend this film for is the fact that this is not a film that is contented with resting on its laurels or retreading the same playbook of Georgekutty being 30 steps ahead of everyone while subverting the audiences and antagonistic expectations via unexpected twists and reveals. No, this one is a bold and audacious take on the Drishyam formula, which sees Georgekutty this time on the back foot at his most vulnerable against antagonists who have enacted a devious, multi-layered scheme, the type Georgekutty would have concocted in the original and the sequel. But this time, this fun scheme is meant to entrap him and his family to make them pay for their crimes. This whole scheme is a bit convoluted and cartoonish, unlike the original and the sequel, to be honest, and the lead up to and the consequences of this scheme or plan or whatever you call it, and the way Georgekutty reacts to it are actually the more interesting parts of the film. In fact, that is what most of the film is actually about, how Georgekutty handles things. Unlike the original and the sequel, where Georgekutty had plans and contingencies to save his family in case things go sideways, this film is all about how Georgekutty handles things when all these securities are taken away from him, making for a very white-knuckle, anxiety-inducing experience that Georgekutty and by proxy you, the audience member, are subjected to. One big highlight is that there is this church sequence midway through the second half of the film, which is the most tense, nerve-wracking, cinematic, tension build-up and release segments that I have experienced in quite some time. Think the Mexico border sequence from Sicario, and what an experience it is through and through, especially thanks to Mohanlal's charismatic performance bringing Georgekutty to life. You really empathize with the character now more than ever before, especially thanks to how vulnerable he gets, especially by the end of the film, and you really feel the psychological and emotional toll of his current actions and the sins of his past finally catching up to him. At times it feels like a deep character study of Georgekutty rather than your usual crime thriller that Drishyam usually was. So much so that by the end of the film I have come to see Georgekutty as sort of an aspirational character. He is cool, composed, uncompromising, and will go to any lengths to protect his family. But beyond all that, he's an archetype for stoicism, something we all men aspire to be. So kudos to Mohanlal for making it possible. Also to be thanked is Jeethu Joseph, the director and writer, for taking this rather risky approach. He could have just gone for another copy-paste Drishyam film like Ryan Johnson does with the Knives Out series, but he chose to go the road less traveled and made something different. And if nothing else, this film stands on its own 2 feet. I also commend him for the darker direction the film takes by the end. The original did play with the audience's sense of morality, to say the least, by having the protagonists be criminals by the legal definition of it at least, but with this one you are in for a much more darker and slightly more disturbing climax where Mohanlal is forced to do something that is a bit messed up, to say the least. And the film ends on a very unexpected note as well, which at least some moviegoers may not agree with, but hey, I do appreciate the risks taken. Okay, so that's a lot of positives, but I do have some negatives as well. For starters, this is a complaint with all the Drishyam films. The film takes its sweet time to get going. This is a very second half loaded film, with the first half mostly for introducing characters and smaller dramatic dramatic moments. Meanwhile, the actual meat of the film is concentrated in the second half. Late addendum, now that I think about it, the antagonist schemes are being subtly executed in the background without bringing attention to it during the first half. So there is that. Secondly, as I mentioned previously, the antagonist scheme or long game or whatever you call it, while clever and multi-layered, does create some red herrings that we and Georgekutty chase for some time. Well, most of the first half at least. And while it does work for Georgekutty the character to throw him off track, us the audience members are also being screwed over in terms of wasted time invested. Basically, the filmmaking and storytelling are so immersive that we are as equally pissed off as the protagonist. Okay, so those are not exactly negatives. The first one will make sense on rewatch and the second one is intentional. Or maybe the red herrings will make sense in the sequel. Or speaking of sequels, yeah, this is an actual negative. The film sort of ends abruptly, like there was more to it and they ran out of time. But most importantly, it ends with a timeline of sort and set up for a sequel after quickly wrapping up things in this film. And one more negative, while I do understand the choice to make this one less like the originals, the thing I despise is the fact that unlike the originals, which was more of a game of cat and mouse outsmarting each other through creative solutions, some of the solutions to the problems for both the protagonists and antagonists in this film ultimately don't rely on their intellect alone. Some spoilers, so I'll just leave it at that. Finally, while the film doesn't exactly scream technical excellence, I do love some of the more creative shots and the framing. As for the performances, Mohanlal is as always at his Mohanlal best, and so are all the other supporting characters. Special mention to the actress Esther Anil as Georgekutty's younger daughter Anu. She's very expressive and charismatic. I can really see a bright future for her in Indian cinema. Who else? Maybe Meena could use a little less makeup. Anyway, all in all, Drishyam 3, it is a pretty good film that challenges the status quo of the Drishyam franchise, now leading it to some very unexpected horizons to say the least. It may not be anyone's favorite Drishyam film, but it does take risks instead of retreading the same old ground a third time, and that is to be commended at least. If that's what you're in for, a fresh take on the Drishyam franchise, then please rush to the theaters immediately. For everyone else, I would say wait for OTT. And until next time, this is the Indian Movie Critic. Bye.